September 1945. The train rolled slowly across the American South, its steel wheels clattering over the tracks with a steady rhythm that filled the silence inside each carriage. There were 200 women on board, all of them German, not civilians, not refugees, prisoners of war. Former radio operators, military clerks, nurses, and staff officers who had once worked in the heart of Hitler's war machine. Now, they were thousands of miles from home, still in their worn and faded Wehrmacht uniforms, still clinging to the fear that had followed them across continents. They didn't know where they were going. No one had told them. One woman, Martha Leon, stared blankly through the grime-coated window. She had been 23 when captured by Allied forces during the fall of Berlin. Her hands tightened around the small cloth bag in her lap, the only belongings she'd been allowed to keep. Inside was a photograph, creased and fading, of her younger brother, whom she hadn't heard from in over a year. Another woman muttered something under her breath in broken English. Whether it was a prayer or a curse, no one could tell. None of them had ever stepped foot in America, but they had been raised to fear it. They had heard stories of American cruelty, imagined torture, humiliation, starvation. The relentless Allied bombing of German cities had left no illusions about mercy. The enemy could not be expected to spare the defeated. As the train jerked to a halt, silence fell heavy over the group. One of the older women began to weep quietly, then bit down hard on her lip to stop the sound. No one moved. No one spoke. Then the doors slammed open. Sunlight rushed in. The women blinked hard, shielding their eyes. Outside was not what they had imagined. A rural landscape stretched out in all directions, rolling farmland dotted with tall grass, the distant scent of pine trees, and the kind of stillness that seemed unnatural after 6 years of war. Wooden barracks stood behind wire fences. Guard towers loomed at each corner of the compound. American soldiers stood lined up near the tracks, uniforms pressed, rifles slung over shoulders. No one shouted. No dogs barked. The scene didn't fit the images burned into their minds from wartime propaganda. Still, their bodies tensed. This was still the enemy. Some of the women winced as they stepped onto the wooden platform, expecting orders, screamed in English, expecting batons or jeering. But no force came. In place of a command, a man stepped forward, young, American, broad-shouldered, with eyes that didn't reveal any hatred. His name would later be known to them as Staff Sergeant Robert Morrison, but in that moment he was nothing but a symbol of danger. He spoke in slow, careful German. Willkommen im Camp Dermit. Sie sind müde und hungrig. Wir bringen Sie zu Ihren Quartieren. Dann essen. Welcome to Camp Dermit. You are tired and hungry. We will take you to your quarters. Then you will eat. The German women looked at each other, startled. Was it possible they'd misheard? Morrison didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply turned and gestured for them to follow. They walked past American soldiers who, to their confusion, walked beside them instead of behind. No rifles pointed at their backs. No insults spat in their direction. Some soldiers smiled at the older women who struggled with their bags. One even bent down to pick up a bundle that had fallen from a trembling hand. Martha said nothing, not even when a soldier offered to carry her bag. Her instinct screamed at her to refuse help. She nodded stiffly instead. The contradiction was too sharp, too unexpected. As they passed through the gates, one woman whispered in disbelief, "This must be a mistake." For the past 6 years, they had been told Americans were savages, devourers of women and destroyers of everything sacred. But there were no clenched fists here, no screaming, no revenge. Still, none dared to speak too loudly. Something had to be coming. They expected the trap to spring at any moment. The gates of Camp Dermit creaked shut behind them, and for a long moment the women stood frozen. There were no shouted orders, no rifle barrels prodding them forward. The guards lingered at a distance, their expressions unreadable, tense but not hostile. The compound was quiet, eerily so. Just the distant rustling of trees, the crunch of boots in the gravel, and the faint hum of cicadas in the Arkansas heat. The women finally moved in scattered formation, unsure whether to march or walk freely. Several tried to stay in tight groups, as if bracing against whatever punishment awaited them. But instead of fearsome orders, they were gently guided by soldiers speaking broken German toward the barracks, their quarters. Inside, rows of beds stood in perfect alignment. Each was neatly made with fresh linens, folded blankets, and a single pillow atop a spotless sheet. At the foot of each bed sat a small wooden chest, unlocked. Windows stood open, allowing in sunlight and soft air, perfumed with pine and soil. On the far wall, a framed chart in English and German reminded the women of rules. Respect the guards, no violence. Curfew at sunset. Some stood in place, unable to process what they were seeing. One woman, Anna Weber, lowered onto her bed slowly, disbelieving. She hadn't seen a clean cot since 1943. Just weeks ago, they had slept on straw in the back of fuel trucks and bombed-out school basements. Now she touched the fabric of the sheets with the back of her fingers, as if it might vanish at any moment. "I don't understand," she whispered to the woman beside her. Martha Leon shook her head, still gripping the cloth bag on her lap. "Neither do I." They were allowed time to wash. Buckets of warm water, soap, clean towels, and instructions printed in both languages. The guards didn't leer or joke. One even nodded politely to a girl as she passed and said, "Willkommen," that word again. By sunset, the women had expected a terse assembly, brutal commands, maybe some exercise as punishment. Instead, a soldier appeared with a clipboard and spoke German like he'd rehearsed it dozens of times. "You are now going to eat." The women exchanged looks. Some had barely eaten in 3 days. A handful braced for spoiled food or bitter rations. Others assumed it was part of their punishment. Weak bodies would be easier to interrogate. And then they entered the mess hall. The smell was the first thing that hit them. Not sour bread or metal jugs of cabbage water, but warm, rich, roasting meat, baking bread, cinnamon, real butter, chicken, steaming in thick gravy, laid out in trays, cooked potatoes, beans, green salads, slices of cake, pitchers full of milk, coffee. Some of the women stopped at the doorway, completely frozen. Greta Hoffman didn't move. She wrapped her hand tight around the doorframe. "It's a trick," she muttered. "They'll feed us and then—" "No," said Anna softly. "I don't think it is." Inside, the Americans waited, not just cooks or prison officials, but a few uniformed soldiers helping to serve food. One man behind the line pointed to each item and repeated the names in both English and German. Beans, Bohnen, chicken, Huhn. He smiled. He actually smiled. One by one, the German women stepped into the line. Some hesitated, some turned their heads away when the warm plates were handed to them, but one by one they all took food, meat, bread rolls, fruit. One by one they all sat down. The room remained nearly silent. Forks scraped against plates. Eyes stayed low. Even as their stomachs shook with hunger, many chewed slowly, as if they still didn't trust any of it. A few tried offering their bread to the older women beside them. 2 of the youngest cried silently while they ate, their mouths full. Then a voice pierced the quiet. "You are not here to be punished." It came from the front of the hall. An American officer, decorated, middle-aged, with the firm posture of someone used to commanding people who were barely out of boyhood. His name tag read, Patterson. His tone was measured, deliberate. He spoke English, but an interpreter stood beside him, translating carefully as he spoke. "You are prisoners of war. You will be treated with dignity. You will not be starved. You will not be beaten. You will be respected, so long as you respect each other and our men." There was no applause, no reaction, but something invisible shifted. It wasn't trust, it wasn't relief. It was the flicker of confusion giving way to curiosity, and to something dangerous, hope. Martha ate the last bit of her chicken slowly, still watching the guards. Anna finished her plate and closed her eyes for a moment. One woman attempted to eat with a fork for the first time in weeks, her hands shaking too badly to keep it steady. Later that evening, back in the barracks, no one talked about politics. No one spoke of Hitler or the Americans or what this meant. They just talked about the food. One said it reminded her of her mother's roast from before the war. Another confessed the cake was better than what they'd had at their wedding receptions. "They couldn't possibly cook like this every day," said someone. "We'll see," replied Martha quietly. In the dark, many of the women lay awake, staring at the ceiling, still alert, still prepared for the door to crash open, still afraid this was just an illusion, a performance, that someone cruel was lurking behind it all with a stopwatch, waiting for them to take the bait. But the hours passed, and no one came. That night, for the first time since their captivity began, not a single woman slept on the floor. Not one complained about hunger. And not one could deny that something was happening here, something that didn't fit the war they had known or the future they expected. It wasn't paradise, not yet. But it wasn't hell either. And that was more shocking than anything else. The library was a single room tucked beneath the camp command center, dusty and plain, but filled with more books than many of the women had seen in years. What caught their attention first wasn't the English, but the German, Goethe, Schiller, even a tattered copy of All Quiet on the Western Front, hidden behind a shelf near the back. Anna Weber browsed the spines one morning and found her fingers brushing against a familiar title. She was startled when a voice behind her spoke, hesitant but kind. "You like to read?" the voice asked. Anna turned. A young American woman stood there in uniform, dark-haired, with olive skin and kind eyes. She spoke with a strange accent Anna didn't recognize. Southern, maybe? Her name tag read, Martinez. "Yes," Anna replied stiffly. "I do too," Martinez said, holding up a book. She hesitated, then added, "My abuela taught me a little German." Not perfect, but enough. Anna almost smiled. Almost. But she only nodded and turned back to the shelves. She didn't know what to make of this tiny moment. It was the first time an American had spoken to her like anything other than a potential threat. She still didn't trust it, not fully. Across the compound, in a small white building marked CLINIC, Greta Hoffman scrubbed her hands at a small wash basin. The American medic, Corporal Dean, gave her a quiet nod of approval. Greta had once worked as a nurse in Hamburg before the bombings forced her into military service. Her knowledge, despite being worn down by the chaos of war, still came back quickly. Dean was surprised by her skill, and while he watched her carefully that first day, by the second, he was handing her supplies without needing to ask. Greta cleaned wounds, simple ones, blisters, cuts, mostly from other prisoners. She didn't speak to them unless absolutely necessary, and she did not speak to the Americans beyond what the job required. But something about touching another person again without anger or fear, that was new, strange, and strangely calming. The sewing room was different. It buzzed with quiet energy. Scraps of fabric lay in neat piles on wooden tables, needles, buttons, thread. The first women who entered hadn't sewn since they were girls, but the rhythm returned quickly. Clothes were mended. Simple pieces were made from donated cloth. One woman crafted a toy rabbit from leftover material and tucked it under her pillow at night, like a relic from a forgotten world. The English classes attracted fewer at first. The shame was harder there. Sitting in front of a notepad like children, listening to Americans pronounce words slowly, as though teaching toddlers. But as days passed, pride gave way to need. Understanding English might mean better conditions. It might mean safety. And for some, it simply meant feeling less ignorant. Knowledge was a kind of dignity they hadn't had in years. Anna joined the classes reluctantly. Martinez was one of the volunteer teachers. Sometimes, during class, she would pause and ask Anna simple questions. "What color is the sky?" "Blue," Anna answered with her hands folded tight. "What do you eat in the morning?" Anna hesitated, then, with a whisper, "Bread, coffee." Small things, harmless things. But for Anna, each answer was like cracking open a door that had long been sealed shut. The garden came later. Behind the barracks, a slice of open land had been fenced off, and a local church had donated seeds, beans, tomatoes, lettuce. At first, the women joked that it must be decorative, but one bold older woman began tilling the dry soil using her hands and a metal spoon. Soon others joined, kneeling, scooping, remembering the feel of dirt beneath fingernails. Corporal Martinez passed by one day and stopped next to Anna. "My abuela, she grew tomatoes back home, big ones. She said music makes them sweeter." Anna didn't understand all the words, but gestured curiously. "Music?" she asked. Martinez grinned and said no more. The next day, someone in the barracks overheard her humming softly when she passed. Over the days that followed, names began replacing numbers. Greta, Anna, Ilsa, Marta, not prisoner 112, or Block 3 or Baraki 5. Just names. Americans stopped pointing, started greeting them. Staff Sergeant Morrison made rounds each evening, asking if there were issues, food shortages, complaints. He spoke with a notebook in hand and listened, truly listened. And yet, the change didn't come without conflict. Martha Leon, who kept mostly to herself, walked out of an English class one day and slammed her workbook onto her bunk. "We're playing their game," she said through clenched teeth. "They want us to forget who we are." But Anna, across the room, stared at her hands, now covered in garden soil. "Maybe it's not about forgetting," she replied softly. "Maybe it's about remembering something else." No one had the answer. That night, Greta stood in the clinic alone. The lights had been dimmed, and the halls were quiet. On the desk beside her lay a bottle of iodine, a tray of bandages, and a folded note written in halting German. "Thank you for helping. Your skill saved my hand. J. Dean." She stared at the note for a long time, unsure what to feel. When she finally turned off the light, she did so slowly, as if leaving a part of herself behind in that small building. The walls of Camp Dermit had not changed. The barbed wire still stood. But inside, something was shifting. Suspicion began to crumble, not into trust, but something earlier, something quieter, recognition. The guards were not what they had been told, and the German women were not what the Americans expected. They were enemies, yes, but now they were also people. By early December, the frost had crept into the corners of Camp Dermit. The last of the garden's vegetables had been picked, and a silver sheen covered the field edges by morning. Though the prisoners were kept warm with extra blankets and heaters in the barracks, a different kind of cold had begun to settle in, the aching kind that came from absence. Most of the prisoners hadn't seen or heard from their families in over a year, and for many, Christmas had always been the one time of year they could count on feeling safe. Not this year. On a gray Wednesday morning, Martha Leon asked a quiet question aloud, unsure if it would be laughed at, or worse, ignored. "Do you think they would let us celebrate Christmas? Just something small?" Silence followed. Then Greta set down her sewing and glanced toward her. "With what?" she asked. Anna Weber, scribbling English words into her notebook, looked up. "Maybe, if we ask. Together." As impossible as the idea seemed, within days, others had added their voices. Some wanted to recreate Stalin, the sweet German holiday bread. A few guards overheard the women humming Christmas carols while working in the sewing room. Word spread quickly until it reached Sergeant Morrison, then Colonel Patterson. The request was unusual. No manual or regulation mentioned anything about letting prisoners plan a cross-cultural holiday event. Patterson sent a message up the chain of command. His request, carefully worded, emphasized morale, civility, and perhaps most compelling, unity. To his surprise, the response came back with a simple directive. As long as security wasn't compromised, the Germans may prepare and join in a holiday gathering with staff supervision. The next day, the announcement was made. Camp Dermit would host a Christmas celebration. Guards and prisoners alike were invited. The reaction wasn't joy exactly. It was too soon for that. Instead, a stunned, cautious buzz filled the camp. It would be the first time since their capture that the German POWs saw the outside world, if only the holiday faces of guards' families and a few local volunteers. For many of the women, it would be the first real celebration they had known since before the war. Preparation began immediately. In the sewing room, prisoners created decorations from donated cloth, hand-stitching stars, snowflakes, and string garlands. Greta worked with the camp cook and a few guards to recreate German recipes using American ingredients. Cinnamon and cloves filled the air as apples were peeled, sugar was boiled, and sweet rolls browned in the oven. Near the library, a group arranged chairs for carol practice. A few of the American guards had grown up singing hymns in their churches. German women, raised with the same melodies in different words, found themselves humming along without realizing it. It was Anna who suggested they sing together, an idea that made several women pause. "In both languages," she said. Corporal Martinez smiled. "You mean together?" Anna nodded. "Yes, you sing your words and we'll sing ours. It's the same song," and so they practiced, slowly, awkwardly. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, silent night, holy night. The harmonies didn't always line up, but they weren't rehearsing a concert. They were trying, reaching across the silence of war with something warmer. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall was transformed. Pine boughs hung above the serving counters. Handmade candles dipped in jars flickered along the tables. Food lined the aisles: roast ham, potatoes, pickled beets, bread rolls, and the now famous cinnamon apple cake. A few of the guards came with their children, carefully instructed on behavior, but curious faces said more than rules ever could. When the women entered, they didn't walk in lines or wait for commands. They walked in slowly, looking around, unsure if this warmth was meant for them too. And then something remarkable happened. One of the American cooks, James, whose German was barely passable, stepped forward and held out a plate. "Frohe Weihnachten," he said, smiling gently. Greta took the plate with both hands and whispered, "Danke." Soon, laughter filled the corners of the room, not loud or chaotic, but cautious, healing. Children ran beneath the tables. Martinez waved across the room to Anna, who raised a glass of what passed for punch, and nodded. Then someone rang a spoon against a glass. The carols began. Silent Night was the first, somber, familiar, pure. One side of the room sang in English. Beside them, softer but strong, the same tune rose in German: Stille Nacht, silent night, heilige Nacht, holy night. When both voices reached the final verse, the English and German blended into one delicate chord. Tears came without warning, not loud sobs, not theatrical. Just quiet streams rolling down cheeks, American and German alike. Martha Leon stared down into her lap, pretending not to wipe at her eyes. Greta stood still, her hands folded, her memories of bombs and ash dissolving into music for just one night. Anna's mouth trembled through the final line, but she didn't stop singing. No one did. When the final note faded, silence held the room, not the muted silence of suspicion, but the reverent kind, the kind that comes only after something sacred has happened. And in that moment, Camp Dermit was no longer a prison, For one night, it was simply a room where former enemies sat side by side and remembered what it meant to be human. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. It was the beginning of something none of them had words for yet, something that would stay with them long after the fences came down. It began with a letter, folded, stamped, official, delivered to Colonel Patterson's desk one cold morning in January. Its contents were clear and impossible to ignore. Repatriation would begin in a matter of weeks. The German prisoners, including the women at Camp Dermit, were to be returned to their home country in staggered groups throughout the spring. The news spread fast. Word passed between the barracks in whispers before the official announcement was even made. And when it was, the reaction was not what most of the guards expected. There were no shouts of celebration, no tears of joy, just silence, and then a slow, heavy wave of something far more complicated. For many of the women, the idea of returning to Germany felt less like liberation and more like exile. Anna Weber stared blankly at the camp bulletin board where the orders had been posted. Behind her, the garden lay frozen, its soil hard and dormant. She didn't say a word. Neither did Greta, who stood beside her, arms folded, jaw tense. The Germany they were being sent back to no longer existed. Bombed cities, food rations, black market chaos, relatives missing, homes turned to rubble, rumors from other returnees, weeks of starvation, no housing, no medicine, only deepened the dread. Martha broke the silence in the barracks that evening. "They're sending us back to die." No one argued with her. A few days later, Greta approached Colonel Patterson quietly, accompanied by a translator. Her request wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was respectful, focused. She asked whether any of the women would be allowed to stay. Not all, she conceded, just those without family, without homes, without futures in Germany. Patterson didn't respond right away. He simply met her eyes and said, "I'll try." He already knew the answer, of course. Orders were orders. Immigration law was law. His hands were tied tighter than he let her see. Others made similar requests, more desperate, less composed. Pleas were written in broken English. Some women offered to work indefinitely. Some spoke of dreams of becoming nurses, teachers, homemakers. But the answer, when it came, was always the same. They had to return. Behind the scenes, the mood among the American guards shifted as well. The past few months had built bonds no one fictionalized in wartime training. These weren't enemy combatants anymore, not in the eyes of men and women who had served them food, stitched their wounds, and compared photos of nieces and nephews. The prospect of saying goodbye stirred an ache none had prepared for. Corporal Martinez sat on the steps outside the barracks one evening, holding a piece of paper in her hand. Anna had written her first full letter in English earlier that week. It began, "To my friend who taught me your language and made me see new things." Martinez folded it and tucked it into her breast pocket with a long, heavy exhale. "You okay?" another guard asked in passing. Martinez replied without looking up, "I'm not the one going back to Berlin with nothing." "I should be." The weeks that followed were filled with emotional undercurrents neither side could fully process. Some women returned to the sewing room and began making small mementos, embroidered handkerchiefs, stitched names, little tokens of appreciation they hoped would become keepsakes for their American counterparts. Others retreated inward. Marta Leon, once a cautious leader among the women, began waking early, standing in the garden, even though nothing grew any more. She didn't speak much, not in anger, just in stillness, as if trying to memorize everything before it vanished. The first group scheduled for departure was listed one morning, 20 names. Anna's was among them. Martinez saw the list before Anna did. She read it 3 times, just to absorb it. When she approached Anna, she didn't know what to say. Anna must have already known. She looked down at her hands and spoke first. 4 days. Martinez nodded. Neither of them said what they really wanted to. That night, Greta, Anna, and Martha sat up late in the barracks. "This place was supposed to break us," Martha said softly. "Instead, I think I might break without it." "We weren't supposed to get this," Greta added. "We weren't supposed to matter to them." Anna looked toward the window, toward the camp fence, which now somehow felt smaller than it had in the beginning. "They saw us," she said. "Not just what we'd been, but who we were underneath." On the morning of departure, the air was sharp. The train sat waiting behind the mess hall, not unlike the one that had brought them there, but somehow heavier now. Corporal Martinez was at the platform. Anna approached with a satchel slung over her shoulder and something clutched in her hand. "I couldn't carry much," she said, "but I wanted to give you something." It was a photograph, one of them together in the garden back in October, taken by another guard who had borrowed a camera for the day. On the back, Anna had written a sentence in plain but perfect English. "Not all Germans are what you were told?" Martinez opened her mouth to reply but found no words, so instead she pulled something from her own pocket, a folded handkerchief delicately embroidered with flowers, and a single word: hope. Anna smiled, tears glossing her lashes but not falling. "Promise me you'll remember." Martinez nodded, her voice choked but clear. "Always." The whistle of the train blew once, long and low. As Anna stepped aboard, she paused at the door, looked back one last time at the place she never expected to live and never expected to miss. Camp Dermit had become something no prison was meant to be. It was paradise, but with a deadline. The train faded farther into the horizon, shrinking like a memory already pushing itself into the past. The hills swallowed it one tree at a time, until only the faintest wisp of its whistle could be heard, and then even that was gone. For the Americans still standing at Camp Dermit, it felt as if something sacred had been sealed inside that metal shell and carried away. A piece of themselves was rolling eastward into uncertainty. Back in the camp, the transformation was unmistakable. The silence left in the wake of the departures was not like the silence before. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anticipation. It was a silence filled with absence of familiar voices, of hesitant laughter, of sudden unexpected connections that had quietly rewired the souls of the people who remained. Martinez didn't return to the barracks that afternoon. She stayed at the edge of the railbed long after the tracks cooled, holding tightly to the photograph Anna had given her in their final moments. It showed them side by side in the garden, sunlight caught in their smiles. They weren't prisoners and guards in that image. They were just women, the same age, from different languages and lives, trying to remake themselves in pieces of peace. Inside the mess hall, an envelope had been left with Colonel Patterson's name on it. It was written in Martha's hand, marked by sharp, precise penmanship. Inside, a single page. "You were the first American to look me in the eye and treat me as if I were more than my uniform. You built something here, even as the world was still busy tearing itself apart. You gave us the chance to remember who we were before the war taught us to forget. If we carry anything with us, it will be that. What you gave us was not just kindness. It was permission to be human again." Colonel Patterson folded the note and pressed it into his breast pocket, where it remained for years. In the library, Staff Sergeant Morrison found a book resting on his desk. A Goethe volume, worn, spine cracked, thin pages marked with tiny pencil X's. Inside the front cover, a single signature, Greta. He ran his thumb softly over the name. The guards who remained talked little in those first days, moving through the camp as if trying not to disturb its memory. For them, the experience had been more than duty. These weren't assignments they could file away. Not after seeing women who had been taught to hate them slowly unlearn everything they thought they knew. Not after watching hardened prisoners turn into neighbors, pupils, and friends. Children still came by the gate sometimes, walking with their parents, former volunteers. Curious townsfolk who had heard of the Christmas Eve carol, of the sewing projects, of the garden that now lay dead under frost and waited for spring. But the thing that lingered most was the realization what had happened at Camp Dermit could not be unraveled. The war had made enemies out of millions, but here somehow, in the quiet Arkansas fields, against all habits of war and wounds of history, something entirely different had taken root. A different kind of victory, not one with weapons, but with folded linens, warm meals, listening ears. A few weeks later, Patterson received a package from Germany. Inside was a stack of letters, most written in German, some carefully translated, filled with gratitude. One was from Greta. The camp had shown her not just hospitality, but purpose. She'd found work in a hospital near Hamburg. She wrote of displaced families, broken children, the injured and sick. But in every sentence was something else, too: dignity. Her letter closed with a line that stayed with Patterson always. They taught me to heal in a place where I was once seen as unworthy of being healed myself. Then came Anna's letter. She now worked part-time as a translator for the American Occupation Office. She wrote of Berlin's ghost buildings, of black markets, and of the ache of rebuilding. But she also wrote about the English words she still practiced each night before bed, about the women who asked her what America was like. She told them stories about gardens, music, and a woman in uniform who had taught her to speak beyond her silence. "I carry you with me in every conversation," she wrote to Martinez. "You gave me your language. But more than that, you gave me your belief, that I was not just the war behind me, but also the peace ahead." For both sides, the chapter of Camp Dermit never truly closed. It became part of them, whispered in future decisions, echoed in the moments they chose to show compassion instead of caution, mercy instead of memory. Years would pass. Many would never see each other again. But every time one of those women sat at a dinner table with her family, read to her grandchildren, or walked through a marketplace where peace stood instead of rubble, they remembered that it had all started in a place they had entered in fear, and left as someone entirely new. And for every American soldier who had guarded Camp Dermit, or staffed the kitchen, or sat down beside a foreign woman, not knowing what might happen next, they remembered too. Because what happened at Camp Dermit hadn't just bent the rules of war. It had rewritten something far more important: what it meant to forgive, what it meant to remember the enemy, not for what they had been, but for what they could still become. They came addressed to Camp Dermit, some in handwriting tight and nervous, others neat and elegant, written in careful ink. Colonel Patterson stacked the first few gingerly on his desk, recognizing the names: a nurse, a clerk, a young woman who had once feared him. Now they wrote from ruined cities with trembling gratitude and staggering clarity. "Dear Colonel Patterson, I am writing from Berlin. It's strange to be free and still so hungry. The grocery store shelves are bare. Our home was reduced to bricks. But I have work now. I translate for the Americans here, because of your guards, because of the notebook I brought home. I make enough to feed my mother. And today I saw a chocolate bar for the first time since the war. It reminded me of the Christmas party. I cried in the street. With sincere thanks, Anna Weber." These letters kept coming. Greta wrote from a makeshift clinic outside of Bremen. "I reopened a small room beside an old church and hung a white cloth above the door. Nothing fancy. No supplies but what I can scavenge or barter for. But the methods I learned at Camp Dermit, they work. I treat children, old men, widows. I think of Corporal Dean when I sterilize tools. American kindness echoes here in the quiet hum of healing." Each word carried weight. Each sentence bent under the reality of hunger, of war's leftovers. But still, there was hope woven into the edges. Patterson kept every letter. He began reading them aloud during officer meetings, not to boast, but because he couldn't ignore what they meant. That maybe what had happened in that Arkansas camp mattered more than anyone had understood at the time. The barracks, the gardens, the classes, they weren't just programs. They had become lifelines. Other guards received letters too. Morrison heard from a woman he'd helped learn to read in English. She had become a school teacher in Frankfurt. "I carry your dictionary with me to class," she wrote. "The children argue over who gets to hold it. It smells like wood and glue and memory." Corporal Martinez saved hers in a tin box tucked inside her closet. The first from Anna, then another, and another. Short updates. Photos of the city as it slowly stood up from its knees. One photo showed Anna standing next to a signpost marked with both German and English lettering. "I taught them how to write that," she had scribbled on the back. Across Germany, a quiet transformation was underway. It wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. But thanks in part to the women who had spent time at Camp Dermit, democracy didn't arrive with a fist. It arrived with understanding. Some worked with the Marshall Plan, translating, organizing food distribution, helping rebuild communities. Others told their stories, first to families, then to neighbors, eventually to strangers. "Not all Americans are heartless," they said. "Not all prisoners are monsters," they repeated. The ripple grew. Years passed. Camp Dermit was eventually dismantled, the fences removed, the barracks torn down or repurposed. But by then, its real structure was already built, across letters, across memories, across lives that had shifted so completely from anger to empathy, it almost felt like fiction. Some of the German women returned to the United States years later, one after marrying an American soldier, another as part of a cultural exchange. They visited what remained of the camp, an empty field, the corner of a foundation still visible in the soil. They stood in silence in that same Arkansas sunlight they once feared. "This was our prison," Anna whispered to her son, standing at her side, "but it gave me back the part of myself the war had stolen." That moment was echoed years later at a small museum exhibit in Little Rock. It featured artifacts from Camp Dermit, photographs, letters, a piece of embroidered cloth. A group of students listened quietly as their guide explained how enemies aren't always who we think they are. One child asked a question at the end. Did they really become friends? The guide smiled, pointing to a photo of Anna and Martinez, arms around each other at the Christmas celebration, smiles full of honesty. "Not only friends," she said, "they became reminders." That's what Camp Dermit had become. A reminder in human form, a place where hatred collapsed, not through force, but through tender, stubborn, everyday acts of dignity. The final letter Colonel Patterson received came almost a decade after the last prisoner left. It was short, just a few lines. "Dear Colonel, there are still days I lie awake remembering the sound of the dinner bell at Dermit. Not because it meant food, but because it meant routine, safety, respect. You showed us that enemies could sit at the same table, and that changed everything." With all my heart, Martha Leon, he framed that letter, hung it in his study, and every time someone asked him what he was proudest of in his military career, he would point to it and say, "Once I ran a camp during wartime, and it became a place someone called paradise."